Hello, good afternoon and a warm welcome to Petplan viewers on Facebook today as we go live answering your dog behaviour questions. So I have my friendly helper Neve behind the other side of the camera. So Neve, fire away with your first question.
Okay, first question comes from Violet. She says, "Hi, I can't get my dog to go outside and do his business unless I'm there sitting in the garden with him, which is impossible to do all the time. Otherwise, he will do it indoors. He's also started chewing my door blinds, and I obviously want this to stop. Can you help, please? He's a crossbreed pug Bichon, and he'll be 5 months old at the end of the month."
Okay, and that was from Violet?
Yes.
Thank you for your question, Violet. So you could whilst all behaviour problems I often explain with any dog are or tend to be interconnected, it does sound as though these might be somewhat separate as two issues here, and we'll address those separately. So firstly, a dog that will only relieve itself in the garden when you're present is of course frustrating for you. Could well be a bit of anxiety for the dog if it's still only 5 months, so dog is still finding its feet, because if you think about it, 5 months is 20 odd weeks, so it's nothing really, is it, for the age of a dog. So I would like to reassure you and say that in all likeliness the dog will find its feet, as it were, settle down and be able to relieve itself without you present. If of course, as you say, the dog is then going into the house and then soiling in the home, well, let's look at that a little bit, because if we can stop that so that then we metaphorically push the dog into a situation where it has to relieve itself in the garden, then you'll be on to a winner. So when the dog is in the home, you will, to stop those accidents, and that's still a little bit toilet training related because again the dog's only 5 months old, but you will need to watch the dog like a hawk when you're in the house with the dog. You need to know where the dog is and what it's doing, and if you can't watch the dog for any period of time, then I would suggest that you introduce the dog to a crate. And that can be done over a week or two so that you build the dog's confidence up in the crate over that period of time. Now, once you've got the dog in the crate, that would allow you in the home to go upstairs to go through your morning routine, because the dog's very unlikely to relieve itself in a crate. So that would be a good starting point for you. And also to get the dog to sleep in the crate at night. Of course, I'm fast tracking my answer because there's lots of little side things that I would go on and look at for you usually, such as how to introduce the crate. So may I suggest you do a little research on that. Of course, you're welcome to contact me if you need any help with that, and you can email me directly, nickjones@alphadogbehaviour.co.uk. So I'll be glad to answer your question. If then we're looking at what the dog's doing in the garden, that could be a case of gradually rewarding your dog for behaviour you do want in the garden, okay? So make sure that because with a 5-month-old dog, I would still be going out into the garden with the dog so that you can help ensure that the dog is relieving itself in an area of your choosing, okay? And when you are working with closing down the opportunities for your dog to urinate in the house, you really are likely to find, in my experience at least, that the dog would actually be really ready to relieve itself when you do have planned trips into the garden, okay? So that would be as I say, it's a slightly fast-tracked answer, but that would be my suggestion there. In terms of chewing blinds in the house, again, it's a sort of thing I would like to ask you a few more questions on. But it's a case of making sure you are supervising the dog's behaviour, and if you can't be present to supervise the behaviour, you need to ensure that the dog is in a dog-proofed location. Again, either a dog crate, remember to use the crate sensibly. We can't crate a dog all day and then all night. So these are the sorts of things you'll need to consider. Okay, so I think it's really, in terms of what a dog's doing in the day, it's where are you when that dog's carrying out that behaviour, and I mean that in the nicest way, so that you can monitor the dog's behaviour and guide it accordingly. So I hope that helps you out on that one. What have we got next, Neve?
Okay, two quite similar questions that have come in on Facebook Live.
Okay.
Faith asks, how can we stop our dog barking in the car? And Joanne asks, how to stop our dog barking at everything.
Wow, okay. So barking, as with many subject behaviours, I often term them as umbrella behaviours. So the subject of barking, we could take it as an umbrella heading, because a dog in theory could bark at, without exaggeration, 100 different things. So let's take the barking in the car to begin with. This is quite a common behaviour, because dogs will either bark, the dog that's barking in the car, you'll often find it will bark as well, say when it's on a lead in public. And because your dog is in the car looking out of the window, it may see a person with a dog, or it may see a cyclist. And then of course its consumption of that visual stimulus is much greater, and you can find that the dog's just barking out of the car at these other distractions. The dog may of course also be barking due to excitement. So and another reason the dog may be barking is that it may actually not like car travel. So it's the sort of things I would be thinking about at this stage, in terms of why the dog is barking in the car, and what sort of things tend to promote the dog to bark, and then we can fine-tune that situation a bit more. So in terms of beginning to think about a solution to that behaviour, we can, when you're driving, of course, it's not safe for you to try to address the dog's behaviour at the same time, and it's very difficult to do so. So I would recommend you seek out a helper, and let's imagine that the dog is on the back seat, securely fastened, and that you have a passenger in the back seat with the dog, and that you then can concentrate on the driving. Or the other way around, you could be the passenger and somebody else drives for you. And then, keeping things simple, what we would look to do is to distract and reward the dog, so that we train out, as it were, that unwanted response to what the dog is barking at. It could be a nice area for you to develop a click and treat method, so that once the dog understands that quiet behaviour promotes you to click and then reward that behaviour, that can be a nice method forward. If, let's say, it's a bigger dog and it's in the back of a bigger vehicle, and you can see how many permutations you can have within this problem, we can, for example, put the dog into the back of the vehicle. We could cut out templates for the windows using black card or paper, and that you literally black out the dog's view. Another approach is that you put the dog in a crate, you cover the crate over with a cloth, so that the dog doesn't have any visual stimulus. Okay, are we broadcasting? All right, thank you. So sorry, folks. Technology. We had a loss of Wi-Fi, so I was talking to myself there for a moment or two. So welcome back, viewers of Petplan, on this day, where we're taking your dog behaviour questions. So I'm not entirely sure at what point we were up to, but I was just addressing the question of travelling with a dog in the car that's barking. And to summarise, the points I was making is that we could have somebody sat alongside the passenger seat with the dog, because of course if you're driving you need to concentrate on that, and that person could be marking and rewarding good behaviour. Okay, and I suggested that the clicker, if that felt good to you and your dog, could be a good way forward. And another approach is that if the dog's bigger and if you have a bigger vehicle, there's a couple of things you can do there. You can either black out the windows so that the dog actually doesn't have any visual access at all. We wouldn't do this forever, just maybe a month or so. We would still look to reward the dog for being calm, or even to give the dog something like a rubber stuffing toy with some food in it to keep the dog distracted, so that we come away from the dog practicing that behaviour repeatedly in the vehicle. Okay. Another approach is that if it was conducive, you could put a dog crate in the back of the car. You could then cover the crate over with a blanket so the dog can't see anything. Okay, and again, these, if you go down the road of blankets or blackening out windows, we always want to revert back to not using those things ideally, although in theory they could be put in place longer term. But in terms of moving forward and undoing those measures, we can just remove bits of the card gradually, or begin to give visual access back to the dog on a gradual basis. So always think about things you might be able to do to stop it to begin with, that will allow you to have a period of time where the dog isn't able to indulge in that unwanted behaviour, and to make sure you keep it in place long enough for you to think that the dog has lost that habit. Okay, and then we can give back that visual access to the dog. Neve, there was a second part to that, barking in the car and then barking
at everything else.
At everything else. Well, I think there's a lot I've said there. If a dog is barking at everything, then you will need some professional help, because your dog is clearly in a highly reactive and stressed state. And you will need to find a good general way that works for you and your dog, because not every method is right for every person and every dog. But you'll need a method that allows you to keep your dog's attention, and so that again you can mark and reward that calm, positive behaviour that's coming from your dog. And there could be a whole number of subtle interactions that are being, or rather taking place between you as the owner and the dog, that need to be addressed there, so that we can help ensure that you're guiding your dog calmly and in an appropriate way each day. Okay, so it can come up that a dog is barking at everything, and really, if I was confronted with that, we would just have to start breaking it down into little headings. We need to get down, drill down really to the elements that are that are sort of promoting your dog into barking. So we would need to come up with different headings. So it might be, the headings may be bicycles, it could be people coming to the house, it could be birds in the garden. So I would look at each of those individually, and as I was saying with regard to barking in the car, you need to be able to find ways to stop it over a period of time for that behaviour to subside, and then, as we call it sometimes in the trade, that behaviour becomes extinct, okay, and that we can replace it with something more beneficial for you and the dog. So I hope that helps with regards to barking. It's always a very common subject, because when a dog is stressed, it will bark, and a dog could be stressed for a wide number of reasons. So thank you for that one. What else do we have there, Neve?
Okay, so we have one from Anya. She says, "Hi, my dog has become reactive when on the street walks recently. He seems to go crazy and gets really excited. How can I help him?"
Okay, so barking in public is actually a nice tie-on to the subject we've just been talking about, or rather, you did say reactivity in public, but I can well imagine that your dog would be doing a number of things when it sees, did you say, Neve, it was dogs that the dog sees?
She hasn't specified. She just says he becomes very reactive to everything.
Okay, well, everything, trying to sort of boil it down a bit in my guesswork, would be things like other dogs, other people approaching that dog, maybe traffic. So we'll keep it relatively simple and look at those areas. So you're in a position there where you want to be able to distract your dog away from the elements that it is barking at. So you'll need to define a little more clearly, for your own sake, what the dog is reacting to. In terms of reactivity, your dog could be barking, spinning on the lead, jumping up in the air, lunging at the other object, or maybe in some instances dogs will sort of defer aggression onto the owner. So if that's the case, and if there is aggression shown to people, you will be best advised to think about introducing a muzzle so that things are safe, because naturally you don't want to be hurt yourself or for anybody else to be hurt, person or dog, as you go about this work. Interestingly, when introducing a muzzle, it can have a slightly, it can quell some of the behaviour, because dogs, we always would introduce a muzzle gradually and in a positive manner, but it's fair to say that many dogs don't really like to be muzzled, and that dampening of the behaviour I've often found to be quite beneficial, frankly, in the early stages, so that you can begin to quell the behaviour in the early stages as you begin to build up the dog's confidence. Because don't forget, it's almost likely a lack of confidence that your dog has. We see aggressive behaviour and we may think, well, that dog's very confident acting in that manner, but in actual fact it's very often the opposite. Also think in terms of a starting point for that type of behaviour in public. Think about how much physical control you have of the dog. So there are things you can look at, such as, and in no particular order, and ideally I would be looking at this with you on an individual basis, but you could have, there are certain things available to you, such as head harnesses, body harnesses. I think those would be the two that come to mind primarily, that will give you a little more control of the dog as it's being reactive. So let me introduce here to you, and this will be very, I am aware that when I answer one question there will be other people listening and thinking, well, actually I could apply that to my dog, albeit the circumstances may be slightly different, and that is very much the case. So I often find in my day-to-day work as a behaviourist that you will have or I have developed, let's say, a number of tools in my metaphorical toolbox that I can use day in, day out on a wide range of problems that may not, on the face of it, be connected. So I'd like to introduce this concept here of what I call my 1, 2, 3 method. Any existing customers that are watching will be quite familiar with this. The 1, 2, 3 method is extremely simple, but does tend to be extremely effective, because it's really simple and that's important. If when you're under stress in public with your dog, you need to have something that you can quickly revert to. And I have talked about the 1, 2, 3 method before on Facebook Lives with Petplan. So the essence of the 1, 2, 3 method is that here you are walking along the street, you've got your dog relatively well under control on the lead, and that you see coming towards you something that, let's call it the distraction. Let's imagine it's another man with a dog, and that your dog finds that particularly difficult to cope with. That's what I call step 1. So it's that acknowledgement of the danger, approaching danger, I call that. That is your opportunity to come to one side, to give yourself sufficient distance. If necessary, you can cross the road. Okay, you can, in future weeks and months, you would hope to be able to do these passes much more closely. But in the beginning, give yourself space. So let's imagine that you cross the road because your dog is quite reactive, and that you can then settle your dog in a position where it can sit and watch you and listen to you as the man approaches with his dog. Okay, now at this stage also you will you will very much benefit from sorting out a high value food, and I realise that not all dogs are food motivated, but most are, so I'll sort of run with that assumption for now, but that you produce a very high value food, ideally something pretty healthy, a bit of cooked chicken, or some dogs even love bits of vegetables, so just use what's good for your dog. and that you begin to feed your dog during what I call stage 2. Now, stage 2 is when I call that passing danger, because from your dog's perspective, the danger is passing, and that of course is when it's at its most intense. When you first see the man with the other dog off at a distance, that's just maybe a pricking of the ears, but as that dog is walking right up to you and maybe passing you, and I often sort of draw a shape from our position with the dog in a V, so it comes in, it's getting warmer, it's at its hottest when it's dead in front of you, whether that's on the same side of the road or not, and then actually as it goes off into the distance, it's getting cooler. Okay, so stage 2 is probably the most intense and nerve-wracking part of the 1, 2, 3 method, but during stage 2 you will need to ensure that you've got a quick and easily accessible supply of high value food. Okay, when the person with the other dog has gone into that cooler zone, or maybe gone out of sight around the corner, you will know that your dog is much more able to settle down, because that will be indicated by its behaviour, in so much as it won't be jumping around. It may well then be able to sit and to look at you and focus a bit more easily. And then stage 3 is the fact that the danger has passed. The man with his dog has gone around the corner, or he's sufficiently out of the zone of concern that we can then actually carry on with our walk. So as I say, while something may be simple, it's not always easy. I am aware of that. So, but the essence of the 1, 2, 3 method, I sometimes feel a bit embarrassed when I present the 1, 2, 3 method to people, because it is so simple and so easy. But very often, the fact that we're doing something different, and that you, as the owner of the dog, have a different process to resort to, rather than just hanging on with fear and embarrassment, that process can set up a new habit. And as I've already mentioned a few times this afternoon, the habit is really what you're looking to build. You're building a new habit, so you're dropping the old habit falls away, and that the new habit of dealing with these distractions via the 1, 2, 3 method is going to be more successful. Just another small point with coping with stage 2 on the 1, 2, 3 method. Let's say you have to walk past a man that's sitting on a bench with his dog near him. Well, how are you going to get past that? Well, just do it in a similar way, but you'll be using the high value food as a lure past the point of concern. Okay, so that's another little tip there. So good luck with that. The 1, 2, 3 method can be applied to pretty much anything. Traffic, dogs, people, okay, and the list goes on. And it can be sort of manipulated a little to suit you and the circumstances. But again, if you feel that safety of yourself or other people or other dogs is to be considered or is a concern, then introduce and use a muzzle as well. It can also give you a lot more confidence as you go about your work. So good luck with that. Thank you for your question. Can I just also add in, if people would be kind enough to share the video as we go, there is a little share button on your screen. That is a great help to us, and also it helps spread the fact that we're on and giving all this excellent free advice today. So thank you for that, folks. So Neve, what else have we got?
Okay, we have a question on puppies. Says, my puppy is 14 weeks old and gets very excited playing, which often results in her biting me. Do you have any advice for how I can discourage this behaviour?
Excellent question. Well, you know, I love doing puppy visits, and part of the reason is that, firstly, of course, you get to spend time with a puppy, which is excellent, but you know, some of the puppy visits I've had have been some of the most challenging visits as well, because a young that is exhibiting that sort of manic bitey behaviour, it's a job to know for most people how to manage it and what to do, because who would have thought that a 10, 14, 20 week old dog could be such a handful. So, as I would often say to people when dealing with what we might collectively call as excessive behaviour in a puppy, we need to think very carefully about how our own behaviour is affecting that of the dog. So maybe some questions for you. Are you, for example, overexciting the dog by letting the dog run in at you? Just to give you some ideas of, in my mind, of what you could be doing, which I would suggest that they could be or should be calmed down. So we don't want to be playing with the dog too roughly. If your dog is running at you with its mouth open and you're sort of thinking, excellent, this is great fun, and you push it back on a laminated floor and the dog sort of scrabbles and finds its track and comes in at you again, you will be promoting in your dog a sense of playing with you too roughly. When a dog leaves the litter, or a puppy leaves the litter, we need to start to show the dog how to interact with humans, because of course we don't have a thick coat like other dogs. I think dogs can mouth and grab each other quite firmly without actually hurting each other, but of course our skin is much more delicate in comparison, and we need to show that to a dog gradually, and that, in amongst many other ways, is part of our duty to bring out a calm side of the dog, so that we're not living with the dog and not playing. That's not what I mean, but we're not, or that we are being careful not to overexcite the dog. So avoid things like rough play, avoid spinning the dog on its back and some of the things I've seen, or avoid getting rough with a raggy chew. I like using raggy chews, but not so that the dog is having a real physical game with you. Don't allow at any time, as a golden rule, the dog's teeth to start to go on your skin or on your clothing. Don't let the dog get your sleeve and start to pull it back and forth, okay? Don't, I would like to say, let your dog pull on your trouser leg as you walk through the room, or don't allow the dog to tussle with your slippers. So these are all things that I see happen on a regular basis, but I have to then find polite ways of suggesting to the owner that this is not really a good way to interact with the puppy, because it's not setting boundaries with the dog. And when you have a 14-week-old dog or any puppy of that sort of age, it's a golden opportunity for you to demonstrate to the dog that you are kind and loving, but that you're not to be, or rather, to put it a better way, that you are to be respected as well. So it's about having that happy balance. So in summary, I would just suggest or ask you to think about what things you're doing with the dog that is creating that excessive excitement. Of course, even if you were being super sensible and implementing all the sorts of things I've just mentioned, a dog can still get overexcited. So what do we do? There are a couple of things. You could simply stop the game. You could, if the dog is being rough with you, I for many years have been using a simple tone such as no biting, and with that I may then stand up and walk away. If the dog is a bit older, and 4, 5, 6 month old puppies are quite capable of being a bit frightening, especially if it's a big dog, in terms of their behaviour towards a member of the family. So you then may be able to implement something like a timeout, so that rather than you leaving the room, you could place the dog just for 1 minute in a quiet location to settle down. And that would be something like a conservatory or a utility room where there's nothing really of interest in that room. Just leave the dog in there for 1 minute. Lots of people might do timeouts thinking that, right, you can go away, and then the dog can stay there for an hour or two. And I just think it's missing the moment, because if you do it for 1 minute, that gives you the opportunity to let the dog calm down, and then to bring the dog back into that room where it was showing the behaviour, because you're trying through repetition to demonstrate to the dog that calm, pleasant behaviour allows him to stay with you, because that's what dogs want, they're sociable creatures. But rough and excessive behaviour resorts in the dog being removed from that space. Okay, many dogs don't need to be given timeouts if you manage the dog correctly in the first place, and that you even consider using your voice to manage the dog. No shouting, no rough handling is ever required with a puppy. but puppies do respond extremely well to a very short tone of voice along the lines of no biting. And I have many a time have sort of seen a puppy stop and sort of look around and thinking, oh, I don't think I should be doing that, maybe biting Nick, you know. And it's amazing how just a sort of a modest vocal correction can stop that. So don't be frightened of going down that road with your puppy. Puppies are far more resilient than you would imagine, and that they can cope easily with being told to stop doing something. But once again, no shouting is required and no rough handling is required, but just that we manage that behaviour in a slightly more intelligent way. So thank you for that. It's always a difficult area dealing with poor behaviour in puppies, because of course we don't want to hurt the puppy, and we wouldn't, but puppies do and can absorb and take on board direction from a very early age. So excellent question, thank you.
Okay, Rachie has asked, I have a Yorkie Pom. He is just over a year and has been with us for just under a year. He did not come from a very well looked after place, and we decided to rescue him. We noticed very early on he had a big fear of men. We took him to the vets and he got his injections by a man. He also won't interact with her brother, not even to let him stroke her or give her a treat. And what can we do to make him a little bit more comfortable around men?
Good, okay. So with rescued dogs, this is not an unusual scenario, that the dog will not like people of either sex, maybe men. It is usually men that dogs fear, but even last week I had a behaviour visit where the dog was actually more concerned about women. So it depends on the dog's early experiences, and when you take on a dog of 12 months, well, the dog could potentially have a real catalogue of dubious experiences with people. And whilst we all love our dogs and take care of them, sadly there are still many people that will abuse animals. So I would encourage you, however, to, in the sense of the subject of rescuing a dog, because many people, just as a side note, many people get bogged down with the dog's past. Okay, what experiences or did he or she have that made him this way, and that people can become overly occupied with it, and I fully understand why that may be, but it doesn't help. Even if you had all the answers, it doesn't really help you overcome the behaviour directly, because you will still be faced with that dog's nervousness in this instance, and the question will be, well, what can we do to make the dog feel better? So to be a bit more specific, you're saying here that the dog is very nervous of men, nervous of your brother, won't let these people touch the dog. Our natural human response is to want to encourage the dog, and potentially that could, for the dog, be seen as a little bit of being put under a bit of pressure to feel good around men or your brother, and that we may, as a result, impose on the dog a little and sort of encroach upon the dog's space to make it understand that they're not going to hurt the dog. And I fully understand the common sense behind that. However, I usually find that the best way to address that sort of behaviour is to sort of back off rather than to put yourself into the dog's space. Excuse me. So what I mean by that is that backing off, to summarise that as an idea, would mean a number of things. So the men in the family on a day-to-day basis are really the men that you can sort of help the dog with firstly, and then, for example, things like men in public, because your dog would never have a relationship, as it were, with those with strangers in public. You can sort of look at later on and build the dog's confidence up later on. But the men in the home, I would suggest, just to give you some ideas, that they ignore the dog fully for at least a week or two, and to still look after the dog, and we can ensure that the dog is being taken out, given adequate care, feeding and toilet breaks, but just to back off and let the dog come to you, or them rather. The men could also be responsible for providing the dog with the food, okay, on a daily basis. So anything like feeding and walking, provided the dog can cope actually with that, because in theory that behaviour could be so severe that the dog just has a meltdown and can't even bear to be fed by or walked by a man. But if that were possible, I would encourage it. Give the men things like pots of high value food that they could just toss over to the dog, and that might well encourage the dog to come forward. I know some of these ideas can sound a bit naive, like, well, that's not going to work, is it? But actually we often find that solutions do lie in relatively simple approaches. Okay, so in summary, allow the dog to come to the men, not the other way around. For a week or two, I would suggest that they entirely ignore the dog. So for example, if they enter the home, just don't even attempt to fuss the dog, just let the dog be. The dog has obviously been through a very stressful emotional time, and it can take months for a dog to settle down. I'm often very much encouraged as to how much a dog can come from to a home in a, quite frankly, traumatized state, and that with some time and a bit of know-how in terms of how to settle the dog down, but I've given you those ideas there, but with that know-how, that you can help put the dog in a more relaxed space, and that the dog can come to those people in its own time. Okay, so I hope that helps you. Thank you for your question.
We have another fear question, but on a different scale.
Okay.
Tracy has asked, can a rescue Pom German Spitz, who is fear aggressive towards other dogs, fully overcome this problem? And obviously a little bit of background about how to deal with it.
Okay, so if I took them in that order, and thank you for your question. Gosh, I'm asked on a regular basis, can we overcome the behaviour? And the easiest way for me to answer that is to say, is to be suitably sidestep it, and to say it depends on the dog, and it depends on you and your ability and how much time you've got for the dog. It depends on how much experience you have with dogs generally, and potentially whether you seek some professional help to give you some further input. In my job, the real benefits I find is the fact that I've just simply looked at these behaviours so many times that it just gives me further ideas, and that's what I suggest you seek out as well. Somebody that with the relevant level of experience, so that you can begin to tap into a level of the behaviour where you really think you're making some better headway. You may well find, sticking with this for a moment in terms of how much you can improve it, that you could be looking at degrees of improvement rather than, well, can I entirely resolve it? So rather than looking at it as a yes, no, can I resolve it and make my dog perfect, it may be a case of, instead of your dog being very fearfully aggressive towards other dogs, you know, at a distance, it might be a case of saying, well, my dog can cope, but only until a dog is completely in its face, and then it may not be so good. So you might find that that's the sort of level of improvement you get to. Still on the subject of improvement and expectations, with most of my behaviour visits, I tend to do 2 visits. And on the first visit, we have this big download of information, and from me to the owner, and that we go in lots of deep depth as to the behaviour, and that they go away for a month or 2 and implement all of these changes, and that when we come back, we could almost chart the improvements as initially might be quite a sharp uplift in improvement, but then that may be up to a 7 out of 10. They may have started at a 3, let's say, but then of course that is only a 7, and we want to go all the way up to a 10 ideally, or at least have a good go at it. But that last 30%, So the initial lift can be found in a couple of months, but the last 30% or so could be found really in the upcoming 12 months. Okay, so you might just need to prepare yourself mentally that the whole process of overcoming and improving a dog's behaviour can, depending on the circumstances, be quite a lengthy process. Now, in terms of dealing with other dogs, it's such a big subject, but we'll look at some of the points here. Now, we've already touched upon, and I won't go over it again because I've already, you're on a re-watch, so on when this is posted to Facebook, you'll be able to go back to the earlier section, about a third of the way in, where we were talking about the 1-2-3 method. The 1-2-3 method, especially if you're dealing with other dogs on leads, because the advantage there is that that dog isn't necessarily going to come into your space unexpectedly, so you could cope with other dogs in public, pavements and maybe small towns and villages. That the 1-2-3 method would work well for you there. We can then begin to look and think a bit more off the page in terms of other solutions and where you might find them. So, for example, quite a few dogs can actually cope, especially once they've settled in, with planned walks on a weekend with larger groups of dogs, and it's not unusual to find a few dogs in those groups which are quite vocal, a bit nervous, but very often they will settle down on these walks, and this is a good way to build up your dog's confidence. You could either do that through more of a specific breed, a bit more of a small dog groups, or I would probably encourage you on balance to just go with a mixed group of dogs. So you might be walking with anything from a husky all the way down to a chihuahua. So that's got to be good for your dog. As already mentioned, if you think your dog may bite another dog, and of course if that's happening, we may have accidental bites to people, so please be careful. I would again introduce a muzzle to your dog, so you know at least that the dog can be taken out and handled with some confidence. One advantage with a small dog is that they are admittedly easier to physically manage. If you have the same behaviour in a large strapping Labrador, then that's much more difficult for the average individual to cope with. But when we have a smaller dog, at least we know that we have physical control of the dog, which is always a blessing. So in summary, think about ways in which you can distract your dog using the 1-2-3 method as mentioned earlier. Look at ways in which you can integrate your dog into environments that it finds stressful, but do it gradually. Try to be aware that it is a long process. Always aim to reward the behaviour you do want, and that's an absolute key way of moving forward with any behaviour. So I think I'll draw a line there, Neve, because I could easily go into immense detail with dog-to-dog aggression, but it does represent probably the most common area I look at, and there are also so many variations upon it. Some dogs can be cured in just pretty much a session, because we've started to wave a piece of chicken around, and it sort of turns the dog's attention. So some cases can be quite, dare I say, easy, but some can be very long-winded and take a lot of effort and patience all round. So in either event, good luck.
Another puppy question for you.
Love a puppy question.
I've just collected my puppy and I want to crate train him right from the start, so he sleeps in there at night. How is it best to introduce my puppy to the crate?
Okay, thank you for that. So introducing a puppy to a crate is something I highly recommend. Some people do successfully rear puppies without crates, but I just am inclined to say that the sort of risks you run of a damaged home, a dog that's basically peeing and pooing anywhere and everywhere, is pretty high without a crate, and that can make the puppy rearing experience much more stressful than it needs to be. So ideally, when you bring your puppy home, you would have a crate set up in a nice quiet corner of a room that you've decided to use. That may be, if you have, let's say, let's imagine you have a utility room and the crate would fit in there, maybe under a work surface or something of that nature. That would be ideal. Bring the dog, when you bring the dog home, pop it in the crate straight away. Let the dog sleep in the crate in the daytime, because puppies do sleep an awful lot, and you will be able to dictate somewhat where the puppy is sleeping. You feed the puppy in the crate, okay, and keep its water in the crate. You can keep toys in the crate. You can play in and around the crate, so that all of these positive associations, which is really the key words, are building up in your dog this sense that being in and around the crate is okay. Dogs are not always from the outset used to being placed in a crate or being excluded away for any period of time, so it is something they need to get used to and stick with it. Of course, there's a difference between putting a dog in a crate and then shutting the crate and leaving the dog. That's something that we do want to get up to, but I would give yourself a few days even. One approach is that you could set up something like a dog playpen, like an octagonal mesh setup where you can change how big it is, and that you could put the crate inside there. It might be a little bit convoluted maybe, but that arrangement can work quite well, because the dog can go in the crate yet also come out, but that space is still quite limited for you to know that the dog is comfortable in that type of environment. In the day, for daytime sleeps, when rather than letting your dog sleep in any little corner, just when you see it beginning to settle down, just lift your dog up very quietly, put it in the crate. Because dogs are so, what's the word, soporific, they just cannot stop themselves from sleeping. You should, without too much difficulty, be able to get your dog to fall asleep in the crate. Once that's done, you can stay with the dog for 30 seconds and just settle him down, and once you think the dog's going, you can then work your way back from the crate, quietly shut the door, and a little tip is to cover the crate over with a blanket. Be careful in this warmer weather, because obviously that you may need a fan in around just to get some air circulating so that the dog stays a nice temperature. And you'll know when the dog wakes up, because it will be making a noise. When the dog wakes up, be careful not to rush and let the dog out straight away. Just seek a little quiet moment in the dog and then go back, and that will usually come after a little bit of squeaking, and then you can let the dog out more on your terms. So just be careful that you're not sort of being too much of a responder to the puppy's demands, because that can become a bit of a problem in later stages for some people. So I think that's covered it. In terms of the crate, don't force a dog to go into the crate. Make it a nice positive experience coming in and out. Build it up. Build the times up gradually where the dog is sleeping in the crate in the day. That could then be transferred to night times. Just a quick word about night times, if I may. Are we okay for time, Neve, to talk about that? One very common problem is that people start out with puppies in crates with the best intentions, but of course the puppy has different ideas. The puppy thinks at night, let's say 3 a.m, it should get out of the crate and have a party, or that it should go into the garden, to have a run around. Now, there are a number of different ways you can do this, but I usually find that the best advice I can give is that you put your dog into the crate at the point of going to bed, and that you don't come down until 6 a.m, say, or maybe at a push 5 a.m, and that hopefully you would be able to extend those times out to your normal waking time, depending on your lifestyle. Because so many people will, in effort to get a good night's sleep, will bring the dog into the bedroom. I'm not averse to that as such, but really not with a puppy, because then you're making a rod for your own back. So my best advice is to put the dog in the crate, take his collar off, just leave a splash of water in the bowl, and that you know you've toileted your dog, fed the dog, had a play, everything's been done, and just go to bed. Because coming down will begin to build a habit that you will regret later on. So there are, as I say, other ways of doing it. Some people put crates in their bedroom and then bring the dogs and the crate out of the bedroom later on. That is another approach. But I usually find that the quickest and most efficient way is to do as I suggested. Just go to bed, you know the dog's fine, it will cry, but 2 or 3 nights at the most, in most cases, you will be on dry ground. So a bit of tough love with the puppies does go a long way. So, but thank you again for that question.
Okay, I think we have time for 2 more.
Great.
Sarah asks, my 7-year-old pug, sometimes when we put him in his bed in the kitchen, which he's been used to since he was 3 months old, he can bark for a few minutes, a bit like he's having a tantrum, and then he'll just fall asleep. The vet doesn't think there's any physical reason for it, as he's been used to being on his own and never had a problem before, even when he was a puppy. Any ideas why he might be having an issue now? It started last year.
Good, interesting one that. It could be given the fact that the dog after a few minutes will settle and then go to sleep, that's effectively what they were saying, would not give me particular cause for concern, because of course if the dog maintained that behaviour all night long and started soiling in its bed space or in the kitchen at night, then we'd know that there was a much higher level of anxiety for us to focus upon, and that we might then want to do something to make the dog better. So I would sort of see this as not too much of not so much of something that you should worry about, but naturally nobody wants their dog to feel unhappy when you put it in a sleep space at night. So as always, what could we do to make the dog feel a bit better? So just a few ideas, and no random in a random way. You could try providing, if the dog is food driven, you could try providing a little stuffed Kong. The little pink or blue ones allow you to put some soft food inside it, okay? And that may be enough to distract the dog initially, so that the dog is much more interested in the device rather than you leaving the dog alone. That alone may sort things out for you. Another little thing that comes to mind is maybe if the dog, for example, is on your lap and very sort of uptight and close with you in the evenings, and then you just simply get up and put the dog away for the evening, maybe a cool down period prior to putting the dog in its space at night would be beneficial. So think about bring the 30-minute period prior to lights out. You could have the dog off of you physically, so it's not so magnetic, and that it's cooling down, as it were, and that also may allow the dog to settle better. Another thought, very often nighttime routines can be improved by a little 10-minute walk on the lead, so that the dog gets a opportunity to have a pee and a poo, and it can go around and have a sniff, and very often it just sort of ticks the box and allows the dog to have a better night's sleep. There are a number of products on the market that you can use, such as plugins or devices that give the dog a natural pheromone which can help create a calmer state as well. So that sort of thing may help. If you speak to your vet, there are some natural calming products on the market which also may be beneficial here. So it's certainly not the sort of thing, as well as I can tell, that requires the thought of any medication, but if in doubt, always speak to your vet, and that would be a good step forward. But I just think with a few little tweaks here and there, that could make a big difference. If you are, again, concerned with any sort of sudden changes in behaviours, especially in slightly older dogs, I think a vet visit would always be prudent to rule out anything else. So thank you for that one.
One last question.
Last question.
Nicola asks, we have a 14-week-old puppy. He's fine meeting people out and about, but when people come to the house, he gets overexcited and jumps and nips. Toys don't really distract him, and putting him on the lead also makes it worse. Do you have any tips, please?
Okay, good. And that was from who, sorry?
Nicola.
Nicola, thank you for that one, Nicola. So, 14-week-old puppy. Does it say what breed it is?
It doesn't.
No, okay. Because, of course, a Labradoodle, a large Labradoodle jumping and nipping is one thing, and then having a pug doing the same is obviously another, and one is going to be, they may need to be managed a bit differently. I accept that you say that putting the dog on a lead can make the behaviour worse. However, that would often be one of the go-to methods, and with practice, and by practice I mean you could do this with existing family members. So even members of the house that are coming to the home, you could indeed put a lead on the dog, because if you're then holding the lead, which is the idea, you will be able to keep the dog at arm's length, so to speak, from the person entering the home, because your dog mustn't be able to jump up upon or nip a person entering the home, and using a lead is far better than holding your dog by the collar. If you hold a dog by the collar, well, it's not a position that you can maintain for very long, I find, and also it can wind dogs up even more holding them by the collar, and some will turn around and snap at you depending on the dog. But I think if a lead in the home is proving a problem, you could allow the dog to drag a lead around in the home, so that it's more used to it. You'll need to always supervise your dog if it's dragging a lead in the home, and to prevent chewing the lead, because that's often what can happen with young dogs, is if you spray it liberally every day with some sort of bitter apple type spray, that can deter the licking of and chewing of the lead as well. Because when somebody enters the home, you're in an excellent position to just lift up the lead and to physically keep your dog away. Now, the person entering the home plays a part as well, because if the person coming into the home is falling to their knees and overexciting the puppy, because everybody loves a puppy. It is a puppy, wasn't it, Neve? Yes. So we could have some accountability really on the person that's coming into the home, because they could be overexciting the dog. And this touches on one of the questions earlier about how human behaviour can affect a dog's behaviour, and we have to take some responsibility as family members and also visitors to the home. So a little key rule is that people coming to the home, ask them to ignore the dog just for a minute or more until the dog is calm enough to sit down and be greeted politely. We want to begin to sort of install behaviours now that your dog will understand when it's older, okay? And there's no better time than the present. So the golden rule is that sit equals hello, and not jumping up and being overexcitable. That's not a behaviour that gets the dog anything it wants, okay? So I would actually, despite you struggling with the lead a little bit at the moment, I would actually encourage you to go back to that. Think about how other people are interacting with the dog, because I suspect there's a big part there. Even people in the home on a day-to-day basis, when they come home, say after a day at work or after being out to the shops for a short period, make sure that they as well are being calm with the dog, that they're not exciting the dog too much or winding the dog up. And then when the dog is calm enough to do a little sit, then we can reward the dog calmly. Another little tip is when the dog is sitting, make sure the dog's wearing a loose collar so that you can slip a thumb under the collar. So this could be your control arm to stop the dog from jumping up in your face, and this can be your affection giving hand, okay, so that we're stroking the dog in this fashion. What we don't want to do with a puppy is, oh, he's a good boy, because that is guaranteed to send the dog off like a rocket. So I hope that answers your question. We are going to wrap it up here, folks. Thank you once again so much for tuning in on this glorious Sunday afternoon, and I will be with you again in the near future. And please be sure to like and share the video as already requested. It helps the world go round and it helps to share information to other people. So stay tuned on this channel for further updates regarding more dog behaviour questions and answers. And thanks again for tuning in.